So we welcome uh, Kay and those of you, Jim, who have just joined us. We're just kind of doing a review and questions or anything left over from our previous discussion. And then if you got the notes from today, and Anna, were you able to send Al the notes?
I have them.
Good,
Thank you.
great, thank you, good. Um, the 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 300s, that fourth century is kind of the tipping point where Christianity goes from being this weird little sect that may or may not need to be gotten rid of. You know, a lot of the time nobody cared, and if they did care, they wanted it gone. You know, those were sort of mostly the two options before that, and it kind of it grows just demographically, and it also becomes more prominent in terms of attracting um, converts from the upper classes. Of course, Constantine's kind of the final cherry on that icing, but it's been happening somewhat more before that anyway. But just wanted to remind. Oh, was that a question? Did someone? No. Okay. Wave if you if you have something you want to throw in. Um, just wanted to remind you before that in the third century, those 200s, so the period of time really from the end of the writing of the gospels and um, canonical or biblical scriptural Christian writing, which you can put at about 210 or 110 or 120, somewhere in there. Hey Rianne, um, is Revelation and the last pseudonymous letters that were attributed to Paul, but probably weren't really written by him. Um, and so Revelation, if you remember, we talked about was really a message to the very early Christians who were subjected to persecution. You know, who were experiencing these localized um, Roman authorities trying to either drive them out of their territory or convince them that they were wrong, get them back in line with supporting the emperor and the emperor cult. So you can see that starting right there. That's sort of the last of the biblical literature up through the beginning of the 300s, when you get actual empire-wide persecution under Diocletian. There's a century and a half in there, a good chunk of time, when the way in which Christianity understood itself and replicated itself and sustained itself was through correspondence. So, you know, we have the letters of Paul, allegedly letters of Paul. I mean, some of them we think are real, but some of them were written later by other people. And remember the idea that things are not better because they're new, things are better if they're old. So, obviously, if people want um, their opinion or their decision about what's going on in the church to be taken with great seriousness, then they want to attribute it earlier. They want to say, oh, this was a message from Paul. You know, Paul said this 50 years ago, um, you know, rather than saying, this is what, you know, our bishop in Antioch came up with in answer to this question that some church had. Um, but but there was a lot of correspondence. Now, remember, we talked about the chances are that in any Christian community of, say, 60 to 100 people, there might have been 3 or 4 or 5 literate men in that community. You know, there were not a lot of people who could read these letters or write these letters. So a big part of their gathering, their coming together, they would talk about the Jewish scripture, and then they would talk about the Gospels and correspondence. So the letters of Paul segued into letters that these churches were writing to each other, in which they would talk about, um, here's what we're doing in response to this plague, or here's what we're doing, about raising money, or here's what we're doing about the widows in our congregation, with just the elements of congregational life. And just like with the letters of Paul, if there seemed to be something that was um, edifying, if there seemed to be something that was useful to a more general audience, that letter would be copied and sent around. So, if the bishop in Antioch wrote to one of the churches in his care, and that church said, "Oh, you guys should hear this too," then they would have one of their literate guys make a copy and send it off to the other church. Um, and that was the only Christian scripture that anybody had. There was a defined Hebrew scriptures at that point, but not a defined Christian scriptures. So you might be in a congregation that had, let's say, 5 or 6 copies of letters from Paul, or allegedly from Paul. And then they'd have another bunch of letters that were from their uh, bishop, or from somebody directly to them about something that was going on in their church. And then they would have copies of letters that had been sent to other congregations that somebody thought they might be interested in or might have value to them. And there was no particular um, way of deciding which of those letters was more orthodox, or which of those letters was more true or right. Um, so it was really a question of who, first of all, who were they from, and how did you feel about that person or those people? Because you might have, let's say, the congregation in the next nearest congregation, and maybe you had had some differences of opinion or something with them, and they would send you a copy of a letter and say, "Here, you all should read this." And you might or might not take that as a friendly gesture, right? I mean, that might have been saying, "See, we're right about this," or you have people doing something in your congregation that's not right, and you should stop that. So there was a lot of politics in those letters as well. And so part of what's going to happen in the 4th century is that they're going to start winnowing down um, what's orthodox, what's correct, what uh, relates true doctrine versus who's wrong about different things, including um, whether or not Jesus is divine or human, including, as we saw with the Donatist controversy in the 4th century, should people who have um, complied with oppression, have complied with the persecutors, what should we do with them religiously? Do we take them back, or do we exclude them? Do they ever have any authority again? What do we do about that? Um, what do you do about eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols? That continues to be a question as long as you have idol sacrifice going on. Um, all all these different kinds of things. There's not much way in the 3rd century to sort out the claims, who's right and who's wrong. And moreover, the documents are precious. You don't um, you probably don't have money to have a copy of everything, and who knows what everything is anyway. So you hang on tightly to the documents you have, and that includes the Gospels. Remember, there are more than 4 Gospels written. There are more than 4 Gospels proposed, and it isn't going to be until like the middle of the 4th century that people start to say these are the ones that really count. These are the ones that are authentic in some way. These are the ones that are going to be scriptural. Yeah, Anna, you're muted, hon.
in these congregations that we're picturing, and there's only one or two people that are illiterate, is the person, the man who's the literate one, is he the keeper of these copies? And do they call him something special? Is he's not a minister or anything yet, is he? He's just one of the,
well, I mean, one of the things that qualified you to be a priest or a bishop was that you were literate.
Yeah.
I mean, that was kind of a minimum. Some churches, beginning in the 3rd century, some churches start to have property. They start to have a building where they gather, but not all of them by any means. And really, it's not until the 3rd century that they primarily start to have that. Before that, the gatherings were in people's private homes, and the documents were in people's private homes too. Yeah, Peggy.
You mean 3rd century, or do you mean 4th century?
That there is some beginning in the 3rd century, in the 200s, of not elaborate churches, not what we would today recognize with a pulpit and but a room where they could have a Eucharist celebration that was big enough for a bigger community, and where they could keep documents.
But were they in hiding then, or were they?
Yeah.
Not as much as you think.
Okay.
This is the thing. We have this image of this whole 200 or 300 years of everybody having to hide because they were being persecuted. Very few people were being persecuted. There are little pockets here and there, right? And mostly what it is the Roman governors, the Roman underling authorities writing to the emperor, writing to the general, or writing to whoever they report to, and saying, what should I do about these Christians? And a lot of the time what they got back is, they're crazy, leave them alone. I mean, don't bother them because there's no point. They're just dumb, So in a lot of cases, no, they were not in hiding until you get almost to the 4th century, early part of the 4th century. Most Roman Christians of the 1st and 2nd centuries lived and were converted and died without ever being oppressed about their faith. They may have been thought crazy. I mean, people may have thought they were odd. But in general, even when there were some Roman political philosophers, historians, they would have been thought of at the time, saying, oh, these Christian people are crazy. That didn't necessarily result in anybody locally actually doing anything about it. If they weren't bothering anybody, and particularly if they weren't being vocal, they just didn't happen to show up the day that they're parading the emperor's statue around town and burning incense to it. They had something else to do. They were out of town. They stayed home, whatever. If nobody noticed, nobody cared. It wasn't until they started sitting in the front yard with a sign saying, hell no, I won't sacrifice to the emperor, that they were creating a disturbance, right? So one of the things that people did write about in their letters from one church to another was local persecutions that happened. And so they would say, we want to warn you, this is how we got in trouble. We had someone who threw a rock at the idol, or we had someone who got drunk and went and lit a fire in Athena's temple, or something happened, and then the mayor or the governor or whoever told us that we all had to show up and do a sacrifice, or told us that we all had to get a certificate from the temple that said that we had done this. And here's what we did about it. And here's what happened. And we had this one guy, you know, everybody else kind of got in line, but we had this one guy who was so brave. And here's what happened to him. And that's the kind of literature that they were circulating among each other to inspire each other, you know, to say, don't, you know, first of all, don't get yourself in trouble if you don't want to. And secondly, if you do want to, here's what you can do. And here's how to, here's what they said. Here's what this guy said when they were asked by the authorities, are you a Christian? And if they had a really cool answer to that question, then it got written down and sent around. And so because this is the literature we have access to, it makes it sound like it was happening everywhere all the time. But it really wasn't. It was really a fairly extraordinary thing most of the time. Now, it's not that it didn't happen, it did, but it would be like saying, you know, all Black neighborhoods in the United States during the 20th century were constantly having riots. Well, no, they weren't. You know, I mean, riots popped up here and there because of a situation that was true all the time. But most Black people in most of the 20th century probably never had their house burned down during a riot, right? I mean, it was local, it was occasional, but it was well known. It was something that people talked about. Does that help in terms of, were they in hiding? Okay. But one of the things that is going to happen when you get to both Diocletian and the guy before him is that as Christians begin to have property, then the representatives of the state begin to feel like, oh, we want that. You know, why should these crazy Christians have that that place or those objects or whatever it was that they had? So they would deprive the Christian communities of their real estate. And also, if they had managed to convert people who were in the upper classes, one of the things that would happen is those people would have their property seized, their family property seized. And that was, of course, an advantage to the state. It was an advantage to whoever was in charge of that community, because then it's like saying you can confiscate the drug dealer's car, right? You know, okay, then we can sell it and we get money for the police department, right? So in this little bit of back and forth that we're going to see in the 300s, one of the things that's going to happen is, okay, all of you Christians are subject to confiscation. And then when the next governor comes in and says, no, we're going to be tolerant, you guys can have all your stuff back. You can have your property back. Or you can have your books back. I mean, that was one of the real hardships under Diocletian, because he was doing an empire-wide turn over your manuscripts, you know, turn over your books. And when people did, what do you think he did with them? He burned them. And so the fact that if you were smart enough to hide your scriptures during the persecution, and then it would be a relief when the next person came along and said, okay, ollie income free, kind of, you know, everybody back to where they were before, then you could bring those documents back out, you know, if you had managed to preserve them. So that was an important feature of the persecution. You really had to work pretty hard to get yourself thrown to the lions. But it didn't take much to have your family estate seized. If you said, oh yeah, I'm a Christian bishop now. Okay, fine, then the empire gets your the stuff that you have accumulated under the auspices of the empire, we want it back. You know, we get that back from you now. So I just wanted to set that up in terms of how malleable at that point the content of Christianity was. You know, there were all of these communities. We don't really know how many, but hundreds of them anyway, organized under those basically emerging 5 bishops areas. Okay, so you have Rome, you have Jerusalem, you have Alexandria, you have Antioch, and you have Constantinople once Constantine builds it. So those are going to be the 5 major administrative districts ultimately, but even that is still sort of in the process of gelling until you get up to about 300. And nobody knows which ideas and which letters are authoritative. You know, if my bishop in my area says this is the way we look at it, well then in general, what do I know? I mean, if I'm illiterate, if I can't go to the text myself, I have to take the priest's word for it. I have to take the bishop's word for it. I have to listen to the letters that are being read and say, oh, okay, I have no basis on which to argue with it. And so that sense of hierarchical authority is also going to start to gel, so that it's like, okay, well, if you're a member of the congregation, you need to listen to the priest. And if you're one of the priests under a bishop's authority, you need to listen to the bishop. And who's in charge of the bishops? Well, you know, that's going to become an interesting question, especially when with Constantine, you start getting the civil authority also feeling like they have a stake in the authority of the Christian church, right? Because before that, the emperor only cared about the cult of the Roman gods. They didn't care what the Christians thought, but now they're going to start to care once you get Christian emperors. They're going to want to be clear about what it is that the church is saying. And there is no clarity about what the church is saying to start out with. Okay, so then just the demographics are interesting because as we talked about before, in around about the year 300, just before you get the empire-wide persecution under Diocletian, there's maybe about 3 million Christians in the entire Roman Empire, compared with 4 million Jews. So there's still more Jews than Christians at that point. And there's 60 million inhabitants of the empire as a whole. So they're a pretty small segment of that population at that point. And by 100 years later, by 400, you will have made the office of emperor will be completely Christian, and about half of the population of the Roman Empire, still around 60 million people, will identify as Christians. So that'll be 30 million people in there. So you go from 3 million to 30 million in the course of that century. And that is both sort of natural demographic gain in the sense of the Christians themselves reproducing. It's also person-to-person conversion, which is how the whole process began, where you know, the one Christian talks to her neighbor over, you know, the laundry or whatever, and offers this message that Christianity is sending, and that neighbor maybe finds it persuasive, or you know, some soldier that used to be part of the Mithras cult talks to his buddies about the fact that he thinks Christianity is a better deal and brings them on board. And then often when either a patriarch or a matriarch in a Roman family converted, they brought the rest of their family along with them, because they were more excited about religion than anybody in the rest of the family was about Roman religion, which was kind of for a lot of people. It's like it's kind of fun when we have a festival, but it's not a big deal. There was nothing spiritually compelling about it. If you think about like the Anglicanism in England in like the 17th century, where it's totally a state religion and churches are totally political institutions, and it's theology is decided by parliament. We know that people found that very unsatisfying in terms of their personal spiritual lives. There just wasn't anything exciting reverence or piety about that. And some of the same thing was true of the Roman cult. There wasn't anything that touched you deeply about it. Maybe if you were part of, let's say, the Illusion Mysteries, if you were in that group, you got very excited and energized and lots of adrenaline going with that point in the year when you had this big ritual around the seed that was being stored for the following year, and that may have been very compelling. But the rest of the year, it just didn't grab you that much. So Christianity also had an appeal for people who wanted a more intense and meaningful kind of connection between their theology and their life and what that meant for them. So for those reasons, the one-to-one conversion continued. So you had natural reproduction and you had one-to-one conversion. And then when you started to get civil authority also promoting Christianity, that made for political conversions. If the emperor is going to be Christian, then all of the people who report immediately to the emperor are going to see which side their bread is buttered on, and some of them are going to completely be hypocritical, and they will be alleged converts, but they don't really mean it. But a good chunk of them are going to say, whatever, sure, Christianity makes as much sense as anything. And they will be relatively sincere Christians, and they will raise their children as relatively sincere Christians. And so that will also accelerate the spread of that sense of belonging in and having an identity in the Christian community. That makes sense? Yeah, Elle.
So why is it there were, a million more Jews at the time? Why didn't Judaism take hold?
Well, because Judaism never was interested in converts.
Yeah.
It was very, very, in fact, difficult to become a Jew. If you weren't born a Jew, you could be a God-fearer. That is to say, you could be like what we would call today a friend of the congregation. You could be someone who kept the Jewish law and someone who worshiped the Jewish God, but that didn't make you a Jew. So the only increase in Judaism was going to be demographic, and then the community itself, the central structure was shattered when the temple was destroyed in 70, and Jerusalem, the Jews of Jerusalem dispersed. And there were pockets of Judaism all over the empire. There had been for a long, long time, but they had all had like this central focus in Jerusalem at the temple. And once that didn't exist anymore, one of the temptations since back in the days of Alexander have been to say, okay, this is too weird. You know, this whole circumcision thing, this whole diet thing, this whole Sabbath thing, it's too weird. I'm just going to be a normal, ordinary Roman citizen. So there was pressure for deconversion, but no pressure for conversion. And you also had the Christians running around making Christians out of people who used to be Jews. So there was kind of a, it was all pressure away and no pressure in. So eventually there are going to be fewer Jews, whereas the Christians are multiplying in several different directions. Does that help?
Well, and there was Paul, right? I mean, running around, obviously evangelizing, but also spreading these letters. And
Right.
I mean, that there wasn't a Jewish person doing that, right? A Jewish leader.
Well, see, Paul thought he was a Jewish leader.
Well,
Right?
originally, right?
Well, yeah, but he continued to claim, and in many of the letters you'll see this claim, you know, I was a leader among the Jews. You know, I was educated as an Orthodox Jew. I was the most pious Jew you could ever find. No, I'm the most pious person in the room. I mean, I can just hear him saying that
Sounds
that
like
he
somebody
was
else.
really, exactly. So he claimed that as part of his qualification to be able to say to the Jews, and he always started in the synagogue. You know, whenever he came to a new town, he started out with the Jewish community and said, look, you guys are waiting for a Messiah. He was here, you missed him, but let me tell you about him, and then you can believe in him. And once he kind of irritated everybody at the synagogue so much that he got kicked out, he had a little core. He had a handful of people who said, you know, that makes total sense. And we want, you know, we want to overcome death. You know, that's way better than kicking out the Romans. You know, I mean, if I have my choice between a Messiah who's going to kick the Romans out of Jerusalem and make Israel, you know, the best nation again, and a Messiah who's going to make me live forever, I'm going with the Messiah who's going to make me live forever. That sounds like a better deal. So he'd always have a handful of those people. And then he would start to work on the rest of the town, kind of saying, okay, I gave the Jews their chance. This is what always happened. You know, only a few of them listened to me. Now I'm going to bring this offer, you know, but wait, we'll send you a second Ginsu knife to the secular culture, to the pagans, you know, to the Gentiles in the community. God makes this offer to you as well. It is not an exclusive offer just to the Jews. We started with the Jews because that's our assignment, but once they say no, then we move on and invite everybody, right? So Paul would have said, I am a Jew. I'm the best Jew you can find, and I know that the Messiah has already arrived, been here and gone and coming back, right? So what he did not believe was that you had to be a Jew in order to become a Christian. That was where he differed from the Jerusalem Christians and the Galilean Christians, right?
Which is
But
why
his is
his line of it continued, because there's lots more people you can get.
right. Well, and his is the only one that's going to survive, because the Jerusalem Christians are pretty crushed when the temple is destroyed, and the Galilean Christians really die out after the first generation that actually knew Jesus. So his is the only version that kind of sticks around historically. Okay, makes sense. So in 303, that's when the Emperor Diocletian actually does announce to all the parts of the empire that we are going to get rid of these Christians. That they are responsible for everything that's going wrong in the empire. And part of what's going wrong in the empire at that point is it's overexpanded. They're all the way from Britain out to practically India. You cannot, given the communication and transportation of that time, you just can't hold that big of a territory together in one central administration. It's just too cumbersome. And so what's happening is that the edges are crumbling off. The barbarians are starting to have success around the edges of the empire. And so what do you do if you're there in the heart of Rome saying what's going wrong? Well, clearly what's going wrong is the gods are mad, right? The gods are not happy with us. Why are the gods not happy with us? Well, because we've got this increasing group of what they called atheists, right? Of people who do not believe in the gods to whom Rome appeals, right? They don't believe that previous dead emperors are among the gods. They don't believe in the divine power of the current emperor. They aren't willing to participate in the public cult of worship and sacrifice that helps to maintain the social structure. And that's why the whole thing is falling apart. Now, did Diocletian really theologically believe all that, or was it just a handy excuse, just like it was for Nero when he burned down half of Rome back in 64? But who knows at this point? I mean, I tend to think that it was at least to some extent a political ploy. But it doesn't matter because it was a lot like Trump and his dog whistles to his uh, you know, his racist followers who want to go back to the 1950s or whenever it was that they think America was great. I mean, this Diocletian had a red hat that said "Make Rome Great Again."
Right.
That's exactly who he was. And how they were going to do that was by getting rid of the Christians, and they were going to do that by taking away the property of any Christian leader who had any property, taking away the property of any Christian community that had any property, burning their scriptures, and requiring them to participate in the public cult, the sacrifices to the Roman gods on behalf of the empire. Now, a lot of people did that. Just, here's your incense, here's your pigeon or whatever it is you want. Go away and leave me alone. Some of them felt really bad about it. Some of them thought it didn't really matter. But it was only the fairly rare person. In a lot of cases, the leaders who said, no, I'm not going to do that. I am a Christian. This is what my religion requires of me. And if you don't like it, too bad. Now, in some cases, those people were then attacked by mobs. Basically, they were lynched. They were killed by sort of popular opinion in their immediate communities. And, when people are suffering, when they feel like things are not going well, it's often gratifying to them to be handed a culprit and told, here, these are the people that are responsible for this. In a more orderly kind of community, what would usually happen is that the people who were willing to say, there's a great story, and I wish I could remember who the name of the Roman governor, but this guy gets hauled before the governor as part of Diocletian's persecution, and the governor says to him, "Are you a Christian bishop?" And the guy says, "I am." And the governor says, "You were," and has his head cut off. But often the local authorities were nervous about exercising the death penalty against their citizens. And particularly if they were technically Roman citizens, they had the right to appeal to the emperor. They had the right to appeal to Rome. And so what would happen is that if they were completely obdurate, they'd be locked up, And eventually, when people got around to it, they would send them to Rome to be tried there. And that's a lot of times when these letters are flying around, it's like, oh, and then our bishop was taken away to Rome and martyred there. Or here's the stories that we hear about what happened to him when he got there. So that was part of the what did they call them in the Revolutionary War? The committees of correspondence, that were trying to keep each other informed about what was going on. Okay, so that only lasted a couple of years in the western half of the empire. It lasted about a decade in the eastern half of the empire. And that is because Constantine, who's a Roman general, actually comes to power in the West in the early part of the 300s. So he is a successful general who has been acclaimed as Augustus by his soldiers, which if you are not the son of the previous emperor, that's generally how you become emperor, is you get proclaimed by your army. And if your army can beat everybody else's army, then you wind up being the emperor. Otherwise, you wind up being dead because somebody else's army conquered your army and killed you. So it's kind of only two ways out of that situation. By 312, Constantine has been acclaimed as Caesar in the West. He's marching on Rome to take over the empire powers, and he's got to cross this Milvian bridge, and that's where he has this flash of inspiration or revelation or conversion or whatever it is. And we remember that Constantine has been a devotee of Sol Invictus, right? The unconquered sun as the only God. So he already has this sort of monotheistic idea in his head. And it makes a certain amount of sense that somebody who wants to be emperor and have all the authority for himself has an image of God that is a singular authority. He doesn't have any idea of this committee up on Mount Olympus kind of having arguments. He wants one guy in charge, and if it's going to be him on earth, it's going to be Sol Invictus in heaven. There's a certain parallel there. And he gets a message, according to him, from Sol Invictus that, okay, he do this thing, paint this sign, this protective sign on all of your shields, and you will be successful in this battle. And that protective sign is the sign of Christ. And so he does that and he wins the battle. Had he not won the battle, we would be having a totally different conversation, right? But he wins the battle, so he marches into Rome, and he decides that thereafter he is going to be a Christian. Now, the first thing he does is he gets together with his co-emperor. Remember, he's taken over in the West, but there's another guy in the East, and that's why the persecution goes on longer in the East, because Constantine stops it right away as soon as he's in power in the West. But he has to get together with Licinius, who's his co-emperor on the eastern side. And you can see how there was this attempt to say, okay, we can't hold this whole big empire together with one person. So let's divide it up. And they had divided it actually into 4 pieces. So when Constantine took over, the first thing he had to do was kill off the other guy who was supposed to be helping him out in the West, which he does. And then he gets together with his cohort in the East, who's been maintaining that same persecution that Diocletian put in place. And he says, look, this isn't getting us anywhere. We're only creating difficulties for ourselves with this religious persecution. So let's just have a pact of religious toleration. Give them all their stuff back. And we're not going to tell anybody what they have to do religiously. You can be Christian, or you can be Roman, or you can be Zoroastrian, or you can be, whatever you want to be. We just hands off religion. And so they agree to that. So in 1313, there is a proclamation of religious tolerance.
313.
313, thank you, yes. Which happens to include the Christians. They're just on the list along with everybody else. Nothing special about them. They're just on the list of people that are okay now. We're going to stop persecuting these people. If you still have their books, give them their books back, give them their buildings back, whatever it was that they had. They can have it back. Now that no one would have thought from that Constantine was necessarily going to be an advocate for Christianity. Although in the end he is, that he does a number of things. He sponsors the building of churches. So this is when you start to get the buildings that are actually going to be expressions of regalness, that reflections, just as when people built temples to Athena or Apollo or whoever, it was only partly about how cool the god was. It was also partly about how cool they were, right? And that they could afford to be magnificent about this. So this is the point at which you start getting Christian churches, and Peggy could probably tell us a lot more about this, that start to be expressions of the greatness of the people who build them, or the prestige and the status of the people who build them. Constantine also is raising his kids as Christians. So that without imposing it on anybody who doesn't want it, he's also trying to ensure that future generations of who he hopes is going to be the dynasty that he's going to establish will also be Christian, so that they will remain in power, and that means they're not likely to get persecuted again. He does other things. He also exempts Christian clergy from civil service and taxation. So that at that point, if you were a wealthy Roman, you were expected to support the city in certain essential ways. You were supposed to be building the aqueducts and the roads and the things that a city needs. That was part of your claim to greatness and civic responsibility. So Constantine says, if you are a Christian leader, a priest or a bishop, you don't have to worry about that stuff. That's not your job anymore. And that results in the beginning of an accumulation of resources, of money within the Christian church that could not have happened if those people had been responsible in the same way that their pagan neighbors were for the maintenance of the social order in that day. The other thing he does, as we remember, I didn't put it on the timeline, but in 314, as soon as this toleration kind of begins to take hold, he starts getting complaints from Carthage about this whole issue about whether the bishops who went ahead and gave up the scriptures and gave up the leaders during the time of persecution still have any authority or not, and whether the people that they ordained have any authority or not. So that whole Donatist controversy is not that exciting in itself, but the fact that the participants in that quarrel appealed to the emperor to settle it is a new move in terms of how Christianity understands itself as a civic force. The idea that the emperor would care, how we figure this out, would appropriately have a say in who the bishop should be in Carthage, is kind of a new concept. It wasn't one that particularly appealed to Constantine either. He really didn't want that job, right? He went to the Bishop of Rome and said, what should I do? And the Bishop of Rome said, it's fine. Their bishop is fine. Well, of course he did. It's his, co-worker, right? It's his colleague. So Constantine says to the malcontents, the people who were sort of anti-Donatists, your bishop is fine, and they're not happy with that. So Constantine sort of sends around and consults a bunch of bishops and says, look, I asked all the bishops and they all said he's fine. And the anti-Donatists still aren't happy. And finally, Constantine says, you guys are starting to annoy me and you really don't want to do that. So he says, I've told you my decision, go away and be happy. Well, of course, they're never happy, but they figured out that they better not bother Constantine anymore. So that the controversy doesn't get settled by his authority, but the idea that he had the authority is definitely something that Jesus would have been perplexed by, right? I mean, this would not have made any sense to Jesus that someone in a community that was supposed to be about him was appealing to the Roman emperor to solve their problems. That would have not gone over well. Then about 10 years later, in 325, we know that he called the Nicene Council to try and straighten out the whole question about Arianism, right? About whether the Bishop Arius was correct in saying that Jesus was primarily human and not primarily God and had not existed from the beginning of the universe, or whether the Bishop of Alexandria was correct in saying, no, the Logos is God and Jesus is the Logos, and therefore Jesus is God, and therefore there's this Trinity, and you may not understand it, but nevertheless, it's the right way of thinking about it. So again, Constantine didn't care. In fact, we have some of his correspondence where he really is kind of doing a facepalm about how ridiculous this question is, that he can't understand what difference it makes or why these people are so upset about it, but he wants it resolved because he wants Christianity to be a force for unity in the empire, just in the way that the Roman paganism had been a force for unity in the empire. They may have had a lot of gods, but everybody got along. But there wasn't this kind of investment in what we will come to call orthodoxy, which is correct belief. There really wasn't anything you could believe about the gods of Rome other than that they didn't exist that anybody cared about. If you believe that Poseidon was really a jerk, you might not want to take a long sea voyage, but other than that, nobody cared, what your opinion about it was. The Christians really cared deeply what your opinion was about who Jesus was, how God was working in the world to bring about the promises that Christianity was offering. Right? Does that make sense, the difference between those sort of attitudes? So again, Constantine, yeah, Anna.
I have a question back a couple paragraphs.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Diocletian chose the Christians as the scapegoats in this what's going wrong thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it because they were the new kid on the block? I mean, why didn't he include the Jews? Had they been around long enough that they were, getting along, or how was that chosen?
Well, I'm not. I mean, that's like saying, how did Donald Trump choose black people? I'm not sure it was a choice that he sat there and stroked his beard and said, okay, I'm choosing the Christians. It was already out there in the culture as a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, let's say, mistrusted the Christians,
Mhm.
felt that they were not, they weren't good sports. They didn't have the well-being of the city at heart. They were kind of selfishly concerned with their own weird ideas about eternal life. And when it came to the well-being of the empire, they weren't even willing to just go, stand in the street and wave as the statue of Zeus went by, or go buy some wheat or some olive oil or whatever and take it to Athena's shrine. Or as far as they were concerned, it was pretty minimalist what you were asked to do in order to assure that the blessings of the gods, that people weren't angry with you.
And the Roman Jews were more willing to just go along with some of the stuff.
No. But the Jews were
They weren't
grandfathered in.
proselytizing either. They weren't
Say
proselytizing.
that again now.
The Jews weren't proselytizing either.
Right. That's right. They weren't proselytizing and they weren't growing. But also they were ancient, and that you can't underestimate how important it was that people said, yeah, the Jews have always been like that. It's kind of like the Amish. Yeah, they've never used electricity. They're just weird. But it doesn't bother us, kind of. But the Christians were more, they were more irritating in some way. And partly it is because they were growing. And partly it is because they were innovating. And also the Jews were very clear about their God. There was no way you could call a Jew an atheist. But the Christians were most often, the people who were opposed to them called them atheists because they didn't believe in the gods. In some ways, the Jews, they had their own God. It was like they had the equivalent to Poseidon or Zeus or Athena or whoever. They just had this Yahweh guy, and they were all about Yahweh all the time. Okay, whatever. But the Christians were more, because the Jews didn't say you're wrong. Because if they'd said you're wrong, then they would have had to welcome everybody into their cult, which they were not prepared to do. So it was sort of like, you have your God and we have our God. And, we have to be faithful to our God, but it's just us, and we're pretty weird. If you were going to be like us, you'd have to eat all these funny foods and, circumcise your kids and not work on the Sabbath. There's just this weird community. The Christians have said, no, you don't have to do any of that. But you have to not worship any of the Roman gods. So it's sort of like all the weird distinctive things that made you kind of say, well, all right, they're just a curious group. All those things were out the window. But the one offensive thing about it, which was that we're not going to help you all maintain the civic order, that was the thing they were really big about. So there was a sense in which the Christians were more irritating. Now, could they have focused on, let's say, the Zoroastrians? Maybe they were responsible. Maybe you could have picked that. And there were just as many of them at one point as there were Christians, although they weren't as much in the heart of Rome, I guess. But was it in some sense arbitrary? Yes. But on the other hand, the Christians made a really convenient target.
Well, and I think what you said about them saying, we're right and you're wrong. That right there, that's a designation that, like you said, the Jewish people weren't offering that. They were saying apples and oranges.
Right.
Christians were saying one God, it's this one or you don't get it.
Right. Good apples or bad apples.
There you go.
Guys are bad apples.
That might cause a problem.
Yeah, right. And it did.
So that one, to me, that one really takes
Right.
off for me. Yeah.
And many of the Roman emperors were too politically savvy to take the bait. You know, they realized that it was only going to cause riots and destruction and, you know, hate and discontent if they tried to suppress Christianity, it was going to be more effort than it was worth. But at certain times in certain places, there were benefits, you know, there were hidden benefits to creating the kind of public anger against the Christians, you know, and then, I mean, I think there's also, and Diocletian may have been one of these people, you know, he's genuinely mystified about why things are falling apart. And this is the only thing he can think of. You know, what have I done? You know, what's wrong here? Well, you know, let's try getting rid of Christianity. Maybe that's really something that is making the gods mad at us.
Okay.
So, but it doesn't last long. Is the
Right.
thing I want you to understand.
Right.
It's a couple of years in the West. It's maybe 10 years in the East, which is, I mean, and people died. There's no question about that, and people suffered. But it wasn't as culture wide as, you know, the classic movies about the catacombs and all that kind of thing would suggest to us, because probably if it had been, Christianity might not have gotten the foothold that it got to and become successful in the end. So so Constantine has this, you know, boiling kettle of a theological issue about who Jesus was, none of the options of which Jesus would have recognized at all. But he decides, okay, I've had it with this. And he calls together all of these bishops, several hundred of them, and says, you know, you guys are not leaving here until you tell me the answer to this theological thing, and until you get yourselves organized in such a way that I can figure out who's in charge. Right? Because that was his other problem, is he couldn't, there was no one leader. You know, there was no counterpart to him in the church that he could go to and say, get your people in line. So he wanted that too. So that's how you get that that group of 5 bishops, the pentarchy of those 5 different areas that sort of make that little crescent shape around the Mediterranean, who are in charge of things after 325, after the Council of Nicaea. And the bishops at Nicaea decide that no, Jesus and the Logos and God and the Holy Spirit, it's all one deal. It's inseparable. And so they're going to come down on the side of the Trinity, or the Bishop Athanasius was his name, which you may recognize from the Athanasian Creed, or the Nicene Creed, which is still recited in some form in a lot of Christian churches. And that not only does that allegedly settle the question, although it doesn't really, because Arians are going to continue to bug the Christian church all the way down to the Unitarians. You know, I mean, they never go away. But, you know, one could argue because the idea of the Trinity is so incomprehensible, but for whatever reason, that disagreement about the nature of Jesus never ever really gets resolved. But what does happen is that there begins to become an idea among the whole Christian community that there is a right way of believing and a wrong way of believing. And you and I may disagree about what is the content of the correct belief, but we all agree that there is a correct belief, and it matters whether or not any given person has it, because they're not going to be part of this group that's going to be the elect, that's going to be the ones who get to triumph with Jesus when he comes back. If you don't believe the right stuff, then you don't get to be in that group. And so the idea of orthodoxy, that what matters is not how you behave as a person and treat other people, or how accurately you practice the cult. You know, do you say the right prayers at the right time of day and facing in the right direction? You know, is the sheep that you bring spotless or not? That kind of thing. That's not what matters. What matters is, do you hold the correct beliefs? Do you have the right ideas about how this whole system works? That's the real outcome of Nicaea, as I see it, is that there's no longer this, we're all kind of making it up as we go along. No, we are going to increasingly over time establish what are the boundaries of correct belief. Now, one of the things that's happening that is making Constantine's life difficult is that the Persians are attacking from the east. And Constantine really wants to be the only guy, so he gets rid of Licinius. And once Licinius is gone, then there is nobody but Constantine to go and lead the armies against the Persians. So he sets out in 336. He is going to go to the east and he is going to confront the Persians. And on the way, he is going to go to Palestine. He is going to go to Jerusalem, and he is going to be baptized in the Jordan River, just like Jesus. That was his plan. He has not yet been baptized. He's been a Christian since 312. But his idea, and the idea of many people at that time, especially if they were converts from a pagan origin, was that it's better to be baptized right before you die. Because if you're baptized right before you die, then you don't have a chance to commit any sins that might create any difficulty for you about participating in the afterlife and getting into heaven. So he is aware that he's not well when he sets out on this journey. He doesn't even make it to Palestine. He never gets to get baptized in the Jordan River. He actually gets to Nicomedia, which is a place in Turkey. And he knows he's dying, so he sends for the bishop of Nicomedia to come and baptize him, and just before he dies. And that, fortunately for him, I guess that works out. So he does get baptized as a Christian just before he dies. But he has been a personal practicing Christian for 25 years at that point. It's just that there was this belief that it's better to hold off on baptism because that gets you a whole new slate, and that's a better way to start off for heaven. So he's going to die in 337, and he has not ever made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Yes, Hannah.
Sorry, but the last rites that the priest gives the person dying in bed, that's all about, is doing it so that they're as pure as they can be right before they go?
I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. Yes, part of that ritual is I absolve you of all your sins. So you don't have to worry about that. It actually is connected to the notion that one of the proofs of Christianity is the healing of the sick and the raising of the dead. And so there's some stuff in the New Testament of instructions to what are priests and bishops supposed to do. Well, one of the things they're supposed to do is anoint the sick, and maybe that will help them get better.
Oh, okay.
So there is this sense of you know, if you gotta go, if it's your time, we want to send you off to heaven in the confidence that, you know, you will meet Jesus there and everything's going to be okay. But on the other hand, who knows, maybe you'll get better. Okay, so I think there's both of those pieces in
Okay.
that.
I just wondered if it was related to what you were saying about the belief about the baptism.
Well, I do think there's a sense of when people start being baptized as infants, there's a lot of concern for how do you make sure that you're not carrying the weight of sin when you actually die. And so that's why you start having the ritual of confession as, you know, you can, anytime you want, basically, you can go confess your sins and get absolved, and then you're good to go. Or one of the things that's going to appeal to people about both going on crusade and building churches is that that's another way to get to clean up your act, you know, in terms of sins that you might have committed. So if you go on crusade, all your sins are forgiven. If you build a magnificent enough church, you know, all your sins are going to be forgiven. So there are a number of ways in which people try to resolve that question. But if you don't have the money for all that stuff, having the priest come and bless you as you're dying is still a pretty good, you know, way of trying to minimize your risk, shall we say. Because it's also risky to wander around the world without being baptized, because who knows what's going to kill you and when, and whether you're going to have time to be baptized, you know, before that can happen. And there's going to be a controversy. I'll have to look up when this actually happens. But one of the things that's going to help to set off the Protestant Reformation is going to be the claim that Jesus was not baptized as an infant. Jesus didn't baptize anyone as an infant. And baptism is only meaningful if you understand what you're doing. That's going to be the Anabaptists are going to claim that. And so there's always going to be this tension between, we want to baptize our infants so that we are assured of their salvation, and that's kind of our rite of passage, you know, about giving birth. And then we also want to have this opportunity as we're dying, you know, to make sure that we've gotten as pure as we can at that point. So there was a controversy at one point of can you be baptized again? You know, can you go back and do it over? And that this goes back to the Donatist controversy of no, if you've been baptized once, you're baptized. That's it. You know, there's no reruns on that. And it doesn't even matter if the priest who baptized you turns out to be, you know, an apostate and a horrible person. It still counts. Your baptism counts because it's the action of God, not the action of the priest, that is efficacious, that makes it happen. So there's that impulse, you know, to say, oh, okay, well, yeah, it happened when I was a kid, but I've done a lot of stuff since then, so let me try that again. No, the church rules that out. And so that's another reason why they kind of have to come up with some other ways to offer you the option of doing something that creates that same effect as if you were just baptized. So then we have Constantine named everything after himself, I mean, including Constantinople and all his kids. So they all have names that sound a little like Constantine, but Constantius, the second, that was his father's name. So he gave one of his sons his father's name, is his living son and becomes his successor. And Constantius begins the process of issuing legislation to ban pagan sacrifices. Now, one of the things we do know about Constantine from his correspondence is that he really didn't like animal sacrifice. He didn't like the blood and gore. He didn't like the suffering. He didn't, it was way too physical. It was way too messy. He just aesthetically, he didn't care for it. And that was one of the great things about becoming a Christian, was you didn't have to do that anymore. And so apparently his son, Constantius, kind of agreed with that. And so there was a moment when, yes, we have religious tolerance and you can worship the way you want, but you got to stop killing pigs and, lambs. And we're just not going to do that anymore, because we're more sophisticated than that. And it's too primitive, it's too messy. So it starts out as kind of a, almost a sanitary measure. We don't want dead animals around the temple anymore. But of course, it's the opening wedge in beginning to say, not only is Christianity okay, but the pagan religions are no longer okay. There's no more animal sacrifice. Now, Constantius had about 19 years of promoting Christianity, and he continues his father's policies of building churches, of excusing Christian leaders from civic responsibility and costs, of in various ways advantaging Christians. But then in 361, you get Julian. And Julian is kind of one of my favorite people. I've really always liked him, because he is the last pagan emperor. He's the guy that comes in and says, okay, this has gone way too far. We're going to do what we can to stop Christianity from taking over. And he really doesn't want to be oppressive about it. So he has some pretty clever, I think, ways of attempting to undercut the advance of Christianity. First of all, he removes all those special civic privileges that his father and grandfather uncle and granduncle, I guess, had granted to the Christian clergy. So now they have to pay taxes. They have to bear their fair share of the responsibility for civic expenses. So there's no longer any economic advantage to being Christian. He also calls back from exile all the Arians who had been sent into exile in the wake of the Council of Nicaea and that theological argument. Because mostly at that point, they didn't actually throw you in jail or burn you or anything yet. But what they did was they sent you away from wherever it was that you were a center of influence. So if you were the Bishop of Alexandria, they sent you somewhere in the middle of Turkey where nobody knew you and you couldn't really have any power. But Julian calls all those, he says, you all can go back to wherever you were, teach whatever you want to teach, write whatever you want to write. It's great. So he's basically saying, let's foment unrest within the Christian community. Let's you all fight with each other, about what's the correct Christianity. And meanwhile, us pagans will just kind of go back to doing what we were doing before, right? And you just eat yourselves up each other. That's fine. The other thing he does, which again, I think is somewhat clever, is he says, well, okay, you Christians obviously do not believe in the pagan gods, and you reject the teachings of the pagan philosophers in favor of this whole sort of semi-Jewish Christianity Jesus thing. That's fine. But then you should not be teaching the Roman pagan classics. You should not be teaching about Plato or Aristotle. You should not be teaching these things that belong to the pagan culture because you don't believe them. And you're just hypocrites if you do. And what that meant was that any Roman citizen who wanted their sons to have a classical education had to send them to pagan teachers. So there was no more passing on Christianity through the educational process. So not, at all violent or visibly oppressive. It's almost done with a sort of quasi sympathy. Oh, we don't want you guys to have to teach stuff you don't believe in. That would be awful for you. But he basically disempowers the whole system of Christian education at that point. So it's interesting to speculate what would have happened had Julian actually had an opportunity to implement his ideas for any period of time. But as it is, he dies after about 19 months of being the emperor. So he really, you get to see what he was trying to do, but you don't really get to see it have much of an impact.
Is he
And then
calendar Julian?
Yes, I think so. I believe so. Yes.
So we got his calendar out of 19 months of his ruling?
I guess.
Peggy,
No.
Peggy, you're muted.
Yes, I was.
There-
But we don't live under a Julian calendar. We live
No,
under
we live under the
Gregorian.
Georgian.
Gregorian.
Right. Gregorian. Right.
Gregorian.
But there was a Julian calendar. That's what we changed to Gregorian from, right?
Right. In the 15th century, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. But I see, it makes sense to me. That's the sort of thing that Julian would have done. He would have said, we're going to organize a calendar and we're going to name the months for the Roman gods, January and March and all of those. So, but I'll look it up and see, but I think you may be right about that. Yeah. So once he is replaced by Jovian, who's and you can you can kind of hear Jove, in that name, but he's going to still be a Christian. And he replaces Julian, and starting with Jovian, all the future emperors of the Roman Empire will be Christian. So that's the end of the paganism having any influence at the highest level of the empire. In 382, so we're getting close to the end of the century here. At that point, the emperor is Gratian, and Gratian does something that has a lot of symbolic impact, which is that he removes the statue of the Greek god of victory from the house where the Roman Senate meets. And the tradition was that every time the Senate gathered, the senators would salute Nike. They would honor the goddess of victory when they came in the room. And so when Gratian has that statue pulled out of there, he says, this is not appropriate. It's very unchristian that our Senate is honoring this pagan goddess. And he has the statue stored away somewhere, but it's no longer there as a statement of commitment to a pagan worldview by the senators every time they're there to do legislation. And then finally in 391, it's Theodosius is the emperor who actually declares that Christianity is going to be the state religion of the Roman Empire, and no other religion is going to be officially recognized. He doesn't necessarily say that they're going to be persecuted, but he outlaws all pagan practices and shrines. And one of the things he does is to encourage Christian missionaries to take over pagan shrines and turn them into Christian places of worship. which they often do. And also under his administration, there's the destruction of the temple to Serapis in Alexandria. And this was kind of like one of the central wonders of the city of Alexandria. It was this huge temple with this huge statue to the Egyptian god Serapis. And it is destroyed by a mob, basically, including the Roman armies, but also including the local population in, I want to say 394. I should have put that there, but it's under Theodosius that happens, and that's sort of a signal of the permission that is given to crowds really anywhere in the empire, that they can attack pagan shrines and they will not suffer any consequences from the government. And if pagan priests or teachers get killed in that process, well, that's the kind of what they get for being there, sort of. So by 400, roughly half is the guess, the estimate. Obviously, nobody knows by exact count, but from everything that the historians can put together, we think about half of the citizens of the Roman Empire considered themselves Christians. Now, that's still only half. I mean, that's still a long way to go in terms of being the absolutely predominant force in all of Europe and a good part of the Middle East. So there's still more that has to happen, but it's a huge pivot in the direction of history at that point. And what started out as this group that was kind of even more negligible than the Jews at the beginning of the century represents half the empire at the end of the century. So any more questions about that? Oh, the other thing I should say is that and we'll talk more about this set of events specifically, but by 400, the Eastern Christian Church and the Western Christian Church are irrevocably divided at that point. And so what happens in Europe and what happens in the East, and we think of Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, those traditions, they're going to be kind of pretty separate. And when they do touch, it'll be a noticeable thing. When the patriarch from the East has contact with the Pope from the West, that's going to be a notable thing. And there are going to be theological events and political events in the West that will have no impact on Christianity in the East, and similar events in the East that will have no impact on Christianity in the West. Does that make sense? Because that's kind of where we still are today in some ways. Yes, Al.
So am I correct in believing that Peter was considered the first pope? Or is he called?
People looking back now would say Peter was the first pope. Peter was historically the first bishop of Rome, but the first bishop of Rome, nobody called him pope. Nobody thought he was a pope. Nobody knew what a pope was. So when Constantine calls together the Council of Nicaea in 325, the fact that they come out of there with 5 bishops who are alleged to be in charge, that is a narrowing it down from all the bishops that there were.
What were the 5 cities that they?
Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome. So that's sort of starting in Egypt and coming up around the eastern edge of the Mediterranean to Rome. Those are the 5 seas.
But as of 400, there's really no pope.
Areas. Right. Well, here's the thing. Constantine, when he's first approached by the Donatists in 314, he goes to the Bishop of Rome because that's the guy who's handy, right? He's in Rome. The Bishop of Rome is in Rome, and he says, you know, what's the deal here? And so he kind of starts the tradition of the Bishop of Rome being the first one to be consulted, kind of. But then he moves his base of operations to Constantinople, which is why Constantinople becomes one of the 5. It had no Byzantium, which was the name of the city before Constantine got his hands on it, hence Constantinople. It had no particular importance in the Christian community. But when the first Christian emperor moved there, it became important. And he started building churches there. And one of the reasons he chose that location was because he could start from scratch in a city that didn't already have pagan temples in it that he would have had to pull down. So so Constantinople is pretty new. It's the newcomer in that group. And Jerusalem is actually not particularly prominent except historically. There's not a powerful Christian church there in the Pauline tradition because that isn't the tradition that was prominent in Jerusalem. But how can you leave Jerusalem out when it's the place where everything started, right? So the 3 most powerful were Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria. And then you kind of have Jerusalem and Constantinople in there by courtesy in a certain way. So it will not be for a little while yet that Rome actually emerges as the premier location, and therefore the Bishop of Rome as the premier authority over all the other bishops. That hasn't quite happened yet. So no, Peter was not the Pope in any way that we would have recognized that, and did not have that kind of authority over the rest of the developing Christian church.
He was way before really Christianity really developed.
Right. That's right. Okay. Let me oh yes, Anna.
I just have a quick question. When Theodosius declared paganism over and Christianity everywhere, did he also, I mean, how did he deal with Judaism?
You know, that is a good question. And I don't think he dealt with any of the other traditions like the Zoroastrians or the Mithraeus people. He was more concerned with Roman paganism and shutting that down.
Okay.
So I think that the Jews and some of those other groups were kind of outside of what he was working on.
Makes sense.
So, like,
would mostly be worried about the Roman gods, not all this other stuff. Yeah.
Right. And the more Christianity spreads in Western Europe, the less interest they have in those essentially Eastern traditions, because both Zoroastrianism and Mithraism they're the problem of the guys in the East. You know, they are not the problem of the Christians, although the Christians are going to have to figure out how to deal with the Jews. And it's going to be interesting to watch that unfold. I just want to make sure everybody saw the note in the notes that we will not meet next week, because I want to do that conference with the ACLU, and it's kind of at the same time as our meeting. So I will see you all in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks for including me.
you.
I enjoyed it.
We're very happy to have you. Yeah,
Thank-
it's great.
thank-
Bye.
All right, everybody vote if you haven't already voted.
Already
Oh
done.
yeah. Thanks, Kendall.
Okay, all right.
Bye.
See you then.
Thank you.